another two in this session, but looking at it, we've come a long way and we've seen what Esther was exposed to. And tonight, as we look at these verses, the question I ask in verses 10 and 11, we have a problem, and it's an age-old problem, of secrecy. Because our text raises the moral question, is it right to hide the fact that you're a Christian? Is it right to hide the fact for Esther that she was a Jewish believer? Does this mean then that it's okay to compromise? Did Esther sin in what she did? And the question is, there are many of the thoughts that go through our mind when we look at a passage of Esther and Mordecai. But you know, our passage remains silent on the matter. It doesn't go into detail about the rights and wrongs. It just states that this is what happened, and it doesn't give us any further explanation. Now we know from the law that Esther wasn't allowed to marry a pagan as a husband, nor was she allowed to have sexual relations with a man who wasn't her husband, nor was she allowed to eat food that was considered unclean according to the Jewish law. And yet it appears that Esther didn't follow those instructions. Her uncle Mordecai stressed that she wasn't to reveal her identity to anyone. So in the text, she is simply following his instructions. And so therefore he's partly to blame. But our text doesn't give us any reasons whether it's right or wrong. It just says this is what happened and this is what they did. The point of the text is God used them in whatever state or situation they were in. And so it's always easy for us in hindsight to look back and say, nah, that's wrong. We make our judgments, we express our morals and opinions on that situation. We weren't there. And I wonder if we were, would we do things any different from what they did? There are Christian groups today that go to extremes in how a Christian is to live, and the expectations they have on people living in a pagan society. Now, what do I mean? How many people have heard of the Amish? What is their philosophy? All right. They've taken, if you like, a 19th century lifestyle as the standard that they want to maintain and keep themselves pure and holy. And they do this to avoid the modern world and what it has to offer. And we've seen the stories and we've seen what happens, a very simple life, bounded by rules and what have you, and that's a lifestyle that they take, and it's one extreme. Then we have this with Christians who, in contrast, take their freedom as a license to do whatever they want without any consequences, without thinking about what the Bible has to say about such things. They're not interested in what the Bible has to say. They just believe or understand, hey, I've got my fire insurance policy, I'm going to heaven, and you know what? God loves me, God's forgiven me, and it doesn't matter. That's the other extreme. Yet somewhere we've got to have a balance that's in the middle. So there are two extremes. But even if we meet in the middle, where most of us are, we often disagree. For example, what is this dress that a Christian should have? Now, when I was growing up, the church said women were not allowed to wear pants. Not allowed. That was one of the rules. Now, there are still some churches that still believe that you have to be dressed a certain way. Or where do we stand on the matter of alcohol? Do we drink or don't we drink? Or what music is it okay to listen to? Or what movies and other entertainment is appropriate? Or what is the right Bible version to use? You see, even in the middle, we have problems as far as it comes to agreement. These are the issues we have. And we're not even at the risk of identifying ourselves as Christians as some people in the world are today. Esther and Mordecai apparently chose to adopt the dress, the customs, and the practices of their Gentile neighbours, at least to the extent that they could successfully conceal their identity as Jews. So they adopted the lifestyle, the dress, the culture of the current people that they were with. At what point does the assimilation of culture compromise our Christian faith and witness? And that's an interesting question. Most Christians today are indistinguishable from unbelieving neighbours in their dress, in their housing, in their professional vocations, in their entertainment choices, in their parenting styles, and so on. So what does it mean we are compromising our faith? We're doing exactly the same. Our neighbours look at us and say, well, you're no different to me. What have you got that I need? It's possibly that we're the same and can't be distinguished, but doesn't mean it's necessarily the same. If a Christian living in a hostile land conceals his or her faith in Christ to avoid the threat of death, is that person being unfaithful to the Lord or simply prudent? These types of questions are ones over which equally Christians can agree or often disagree. And that's the freedom we have. But regardless of who is right and who is wrong, the story of Esther is of powerful encouragement to all of us. We can know that whether we are right or wrong, whether we're living with pure motives or impure, God is at work even with our most imperfect decisions and actions, and will use those to fulfill his purposes. It's often easy to look at other people's decisions and judge them, thinking that we know clearly what is right or wrong, and that if we were in their shoes, we would have known the right thing to do. And isn't that how today our culture looks back on history that was and says they were wrong for doing it, because what we know today is the principles that are applying to that day? It doesn't work. You see, it's easy for us to talk about ethical and moral issues, if you like. It's theory. We can define it so the choices are clear. But you know what? Life is not neat, tidy, and clear with all the decisions that have to be made. There are lots of areas of grey. And this episode from Esther offers us great encouragement and comfort when we find ourselves in situations where every choice is an odd mixture of right and wrong. Only God knows the end of our story from the beginning, and we are simply responsible for living faithfully in obedience to his word in every situation to the best of our ability. Now we look in verse 10 at the parentage in verse 10. Esther did not tell anyone about her family or who her people were, because Mordecai had told her not to do so. We need to understand the public opinion at that time towards Jewish people wasn't the most favourable. And it appears that Esther's decision, under her uncle's instruction, was that she wasn't to let anyone know of her family background or identity. And it was a wise one considering the exact times in which they lived. One can only imagine the underlying tensions that existed. And it wouldn't take long before things escalated into situations where the Jewish people, who were a minority in society, would have been obliterated by those in positions of power, as we will see unfold in the next few chapters. We need to consider that God is working behind the scenes to preserve his people. And if he hadn't been, it would have been a setback if people had discovered Esther's ancestry before she became queen, because it would have disqualified her from being in that position. And there's an interesting word that is used in the Greek, upovekenu, which means to show by placing oneself under one's eyes. In other words, to draw attention to something. And this was something Esther was intent on not doing, not revealing her identity as a Jewish person. Yet she was living right before the eyes of her neighbours and those around her, but she wasn't revealing her identity. She was not drawing attention or making a big deal that, hey, I'm Jewish. And the text doesn't give any indication as to why Mordecai instructed her not to disclose her identity to anyone. But we're given some indication in Ezra 4, verses 4 to 7, where it says, "Then the people around them tried to discourage the people of Judah by making them afraid to build. Their enemies hired others to delay the building plans during the time Cyrus was king of Persia. It continued until the time of Darius was king of Persia. When Xerxes first became king, those enemies wrote a letter against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. When Artaxerxes became king of Judah, Bishlam, Mithran, Tabeel, and those with them wrote a letter to Artaxerxes. It was written in the Aramaic language and translated. In other words, there was persecution. It wasn't a good time to let people know, hey, I'm Jewish." Ezra provides us with information about the succession of Persian kings and what it was like from the time of Cyrus through to Artaxerxes. That's a 50-year period. And in that 50-year period, it shows the opposition that was there during the time of the Jewish people. The temple had been built, but persecution had been ongoing since the early time of Xerxes' reign. And it's thought that Mordecai was astute enough to know about the accusations being made that were sent to the king at the beginning of the reign. He was made aware of it, and he feared the reprisals that the king might have made if he had been aware of Esther's background, that she was Jewish. So what we have is Esther and Mordecai. They became like chameleons. They blended in. They were there, but they weren't there, if you can understand that. They hid who they really were, but they blended in to the society. They did everything that normal people in society were doing, and their neighbours never suspected them of anything. If you like, they were the model citizens of the time. They had grown accustomed and comfortable with life like many other Jews at the time. In other words, if you looked at them, you would say, nothing to see here. They're all the same, no problems. They just appeared like normal, everyday people. Now, that doesn't make it right that they choose to do what they did, to adopt and to adapt the ways of the world. And we might not like what we read, but God takes what people have, he takes where they're at, and use to accomplish his purposes despite their failures, despite their disobedience. God was able to make something good come out of some bad decisions. We see the proximity. Every day, Mordecai walked back and forth near the courtyard where the king's women lived to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now it shows us and tells us a little bit about Mordecai's responsibility and integrity. The events that had happened when the king promoted and called the beauty contest, it was a no-win situation for both Esther and Mordecai. If they refused to comply, serious consequences, and they were not prepared to take those consequences. So they did the best they could with the situation they were in. Mordecai had taken the responsibility to bring Esther up as his own daughter. Her parents had died. And because she was in the palace, it didn't mean Mordecai was giving up on her. I suggest that maybe he was feeling a little guilty that it was his fault she was there. He did have a position in the palace, but he could do nothing to help her from what was happening. But this position he had in the palace gave him access to other places. And where others are restricted, it seems that Mordecai was able to have access to these areas to be able to keep tabs on Esther. Mordecai checked on her welfare every day. His job allowed him to do this without drawing undue attention to them. And he walked backwards and forwards. In other words, the idea here, he paced backwards, upwards and forwards. You know when you've got a problem and you... I can imagine him walking in the palace every day, wondering what Esther was doing and was she okay? He was concerned. Now, there's still some people who think, well, it's just coincidence that he happened to be there. But God had his handprints all over this. It wasn't luck. It wasn't random chance that it happened this way. We understand from reading the scriptures, God moves in a certain way. He will choose the people he wants to use. And he's always prepared everything in advance. He opens the doors that we cannot, to put us in the right places among the right people so that these plans will be carried out. It wasn't chance that Esther happened to be chosen or where she was, and it wasn't chance that Mordecai just happened to be in this position in the palace with access to go backwards and forwards. Then we have what I call the productive strategies in verses 12 to 15. What do you do when you find yourself in difficult circumstances? You want to examine all your options. You want to come up with a plan that will allow you to achieve your goals while avoiding the things that you think are detrimental to your succeeding with your strategy. Now, what is the strategy? We always hear people say, what's your strategy? What's your 5-year plan? If you're in business, what's your strategies? How are you going to deal with it? Well, someone has said, strategy is the intelligent allocation of resources through a unique system of activities to achieve a goal. Simply translating that, it means, what are you going to do to achieve your goals? That's what it means. A strategy is, how am I going to use what I have available to me at this time? In the time that I do have, what are my abilities to see it through? Who can help me achieve the end goal? In other words, it's a plan that is prepared to move forward rather than just sit and feel as though you're a victim of circumstances. And I guess one of those things, if you're in a beauty contest, what is your strategy? It's very simple, isn't it? Win. Win. Isn't that it? Because if you fail, what's going to happen to you? You just take a place in the king's harem and you're forgotten about. So your strategy would be to win. That means looking, examining and knowing your competitors, their strengths and weaknesses, and if you like, allowing yourself to have an edge in what you present that will be more valuable than what your competitors offer. Never lose sight of your strategy or what you're trying to achieve and how you do it. Know what you want to do and where you want to go and how you want to get there. Now that sounds very businesslike, but as we'll see, there are principles here. Esther was in a situation that was not of her choosing. She had no control over the outcomes. And so she has to assess the situation and make the most of what she could with what was available to her. And she was in a palace. Then we talk about the preparation in verse 12. Before a girl could take her turn with King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments that were ordered for the women. For 6 months, she was treated with oil and myrrh, and for 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. Wow. All laid on by the king. Now, it didn't take Esther long to know what was going on or to understand the process, and it was to her advantage to use whatever was available to her. The process and preparation would culminate, if you like, in a one-night stand in the king's bed. And if a girl performed to the king's standard, then she would become his queen. That was the end of the story. That was the end of the process. And it didn't take Esther long to realise she had no options when it came to this 12-month preparation. It all came down to how she used these treatments to the best advantage, knowing that all the young women were in the same boat, all looking for some edge in securing the goal to become the Queen of Persia. The performance. Then she was ready to go to the king. Anything she asked for was given to her to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she would go to the king's palace. In the morning she would return to another part of the king's women's quarters. Then she would be placed under the care of Shazgar, the king's eunuch in charge of the slave women. The girl would not go back to the king unless he was pleased with her and asked for her by name. Now, it doesn't take rocket science or an academic degree to understand what was required. These women had been taken to the palace against their will, and they knew what was expected of them. After a year's preparation, each young woman was given the opportunity to pleasure the king. Now, it sounds rather gross, but that was the period of the time. The one who impressed him the most with her performance, she would become queen. Remember, there's only one judge. That was the king. And it was a judgment on whether she was good looking and whether she was a virgin and whether she pleased the king. That's all. Now, it's not much of a future, but remember the options. They were provided with everything they wanted. They were schooled in the ways a woman could please a man, so they would all have the same opportunities to impress. And each of these young women had one chance to impress the king, because after this one-night fling, she was returned to the harem with all the other women, waiting to be summoned by the king. And if she wasn't, she was relegated to a life in the harem where she would simply remain as his possession and property, along with all the other women, would have no opportunity to have a family or to be loved by any other man. As much as we do not want to think about it and what's taking place here, it is what it is. It is sexual exploitation of the highest order. This was the priority of the king. These women spent 12 months preparing for a one-night stand in the king's bed to pleasure him and make him happy. That was it. Now, I don't know how the Go Fund would get up and have a protest with that today, but in those times, the king was the supreme ruler and his word went. He had no concern for the welfare of these young women. He didn't care that he's robbing them of a future, as long as he was pampered and pleasured by all these beautiful young women. Now, we could translate that over to our modern day culture, because our society is obsessed, if you like, with looking good and sexual freedom. Anything goes. Many marriages, many relationships are primarily based on physical attractions and attributes and the ability to satisfy one's own physical appetites. You see the advertising. What does the ideal bloke look like? He's got to have a six-pack, 6'2", eyes are blue. There's a standard, and he's got to look good. And he's got to be able to perform. He's got to be able to make me happy. That was the requirement. And you see, that comes over even into marriage relationships as well. You see, marriage today is not valued as something sacred and special. It's just a means for personal satisfaction. And when that attraction fades or diminishes, what happens to the marriage? It ends. And each partner looks for someone else to fulfill their sexual and sensual appetites. Sadly, that's happening more and more in our society. Once the physical goes, people tend to look at the other man's grass is always greener. There's something better on the other side. The problem is when you get over to the other side, it's the same as what it was back then. And it's a sad reflection to think we haven't learnt very much throughout the centuries. Oh, we might dress it up a little bit more in modern language, but there's no denying the similarities in the end goals of the time, because it comes down to a society that is seeking its own pleasures and performances. Appearances matter. Looking good is a must in our society today. Just ask the cosmetic industry. How much money is spent on looking good? Everybody wants to look good. It's done on the physical appearances, so nothing has changed. The positivity. The time came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, Mordecai's uncle, who had been adopted by Mordecai, to go to the king. She asked for only what Hegai suggested she should take. Hegai was the king's eunuch who was in charge of the women. Everyone who saw Esther liked her. Now, I can only imagine the apprehension of these young women as each one was summoned to the king's bedchamber, and what awaited them. Esther was not only beautiful, she was intelligent, and she had worked out who could provide her with the information she needed to provide her with an edge over the other women. She made friends with Hegai, the king's chamberlain and keeper of the harem. In other words, he was somebody who would know what the king liked and disliked, and who could advise her on these delicate matters. In other words, she had her head screwed on the right way to deal with a situation she had no control over. It says she obtained favour with Hegai, and in fact our text reveals that everybody liked Esther. Now think about her situation. She could have sat back and said, "Woe is me. Poor little old me. I'm a victim in all of this. What can I do? I'll just have to go with the flow, and I can feel sorry for myself." She could have taken a negative attitude, but she was positive. She was determined to use the situation to her advantage by seeking help from those who knew what was what and how to go about doing things the right way to make that right impression. Now, Esther was preparing for this one-night stand. She sought the advice of Haggai, and what he suggested she take when she was summoned by the king. And what it means here is she took nothing to enhance what she already had, and she already had a natural beauty. She didn't need anything else. She didn't need all the cosmetics. But I believe also that Esther had a beauty that radiated from within, that matched the outward beauty. And that's something you can't buy. It's something you can't treat. And Esther had this in spades. We may be thinking, how could God use such a process like this? Now, in fairness, I have no doubts God was not pleased with what was happening. This would not have been his choice in the way things had happened. However, he did use the situation that was presented by sinful men to accomplish his plan, and that plan was the preservation of his people. He used bad decisions for a good outcome for his people. Because God is sovereign, he knew the heart and intentions of Esther and Mordecai. In other words, he looks beneath the surface of things, and that's all we do. We look at what happened on the surface. But God looks below that to see things the way they really are and how they can best be used. Now, if we're honest, and we think back to times in our own lives, think of some of the decisions and choices that we've made that were definitely wrong. And yet God used them to make things right. And I'm sure if we had our time over again, we wouldn't have made those choices. However, we can't go back to the past and change them. But God has taken those situations, taken those wrong choices, and turned them into something good. It could have turned out the opposite, but he turned it out for things that were good. And so this should be an encouragement to all of us. We're not perfect. We do make mistakes. We do fail. But God can and does use those failures to teach us, to draw us closer to himself and make something good come out of all of these things. And I'll leave it there because we have a couple more that will probably take a bit. But it's just to show us that, well, we might not agree with the things that these people did. And God certainly wouldn't have put his stamp of approval. Yes, I approve, go ahead and do this. He took what was there and used it for the greater good of his people. Now, I'm sure Esther and Mordecai had no idea how God was going to use them, but he did use them. He did put them in those positions for a time that was coming. He prepared them. And God can take us and use us even when we make some bad choices. Sometimes he'll let us learn from those choices, and hopefully we will learn. We don't do those choices, but we rely on him. But often he will take those choices because he has a plan and purpose for us and will work them out, whereas we couldn't. And so we need to see things through the eyes of Scripture, not through our own, shall I say, coloured glasses, because we were not there. We were not living under the times, and it's hard for us in the present day to take what we know and apply it in their times. We can't do that. A day is coming when there'll be people that look back on our times and the things that we've done, and they'll judge us by their standards. And they won't be able to see, you can't do that. You just can't do that. God has a purpose and a plan. And next week we'll look at this process of selection and what God did to use that. As we close, we're going to turn in